Well, good afternoon. It's great to see everybody here, and thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy this as much as I do. And I also have to say, the reason I'm up here is to introduce a couple of people, and I'm very honored to do that. They are two individuals that I really like talking to because they have such different backgrounds than me. One was a former political strategist, was a cabinet secretary for Ronald Reagan, chief of staff for George H.W. Bush, was the president and CEO of the National Chain Drug Association. And then the other individual started out in the trucking industry. They started a company to do on-demand freight services, started a company that created fleet fuel cards and debit cards, and then started a company called Freightways, of which he's currently CEO of, that is the source for supply chain and logistics, analytics, and news. Now you're saying to yourself, well, that's all highly interesting and very commendable, but what the heck does that have to do with aviation? Well, one of these individuals had been a pilot for probably 50 years. It's the former president of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. Is the co-chairman of Redbird Flight Simulations. I know he sits on the board of directors of at least one aircraft manufacturer and a drone manufacturer, so he's got his aviation creds. The other one has been a pilot for probably 30 years, and about 2.5 years ago purchased Flying Magazine, of which he is the current CEO. And during the last 2.5 years has purchased up the majority of all other aviation media websites and content, creating the Flying Media Group, which he is now rebranded as Firecrown, that encompasses all of the aviation, marine, lifestyle, what other publications and stuff that they have. It's a list too long. So they've got good aviation credentials. But the biggest reason I'm excited is that Redbird is playing Mythbuster today. All right? I mean, you probably all figured out who I'm talking about now. I'm talking about Craig Fuller and Craig Fuller. So we're playing Mythbusters. No, there is not a singular Craig Fuller. There are actually two Craig Fullers. Today, they're going to have a little fireside conversation that I think you will find enjoyable, and I hope you're looking forward to it as much as I am. So, Craig Fuller and Craig Fuller.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Todd. Well, only Redbird could actually pull this off and get us together. We have not met before, although we've spoken by phone. Imagine the excitement I felt when Todd told me he wanted me to come here today for an interview with Craig Fuller. And I thought, well, I haven't been interviewed by Flying Magazine for years. Then it turns out I'm the interviewer, although we both agreed we would ask each other some questions. I want to start with one story, though, about this phenomenon of two people involved in aviation with the same name. I was in Washington, D.C. early one morning, about 2.5 years ago, I think it was, or maybe 3. And I got a call from somebody at Bonnier Publication saying, I just got into the office and I've discovered that I'm in a small group of some of our leadership for lunch with you, and I just wondered if you would stay around for a while and we could chat after lunch. And I said, well, my afternoon is free, but I'm in Washington, D.C. Where are you? He said, well, I'm in Florida. I said, I don't think it's me you're having lunch with. About 3 hours later, he called back and he said, by the way, don't mention to anybody that I called you. And that, I think, was one of the early meetings, if I'm not mistaken, that you had with the Bonnier people.
It was. I made a cold outreach to the Bonnier folks to see if they would sell Flying Magazine. And they responded to my surprise, and they said, it's not for sale, but we're happy to talk to you. But they had thought I was you. And so when, really, in the early days of when we bought Flying Magazine, it was commonly assumed that I was that Craig Fuller, I was you. It is exciting to meet you here. It's also exciting to be on stage with you because I can't forget your name. It's the easiest name I have to remember. But it is interesting. Our paths have crossed. In fact, when I was 5 years old, my mother has a newspaper printout, in the old days when newspapers mattered, of you, Craig Fuller. She thought that was cute, that someone of importance had the same name as her son. So it's fun to meet you.
I hope it didn't hold you back.
It was an inspiration.
An inspiration. Last night. Listen, I really am the interviewer. I want to talk about what you're doing now, but I want to talk about the journey you've been on, because I believe you started flying early.
It's 13.
When you were 13. So tell us about that. How did this notion come into your head that you wanted to go fly an airplane?
I grew up in a generation where Top Gun, I was 6 years old when Maverick came out, or the Top Gun, the first Maverick, if you will, 1985. And I think we watched that. I made my parents take me to the movie theaters like a dozen times before VHS was really ubiquitous. I don't think we had a Blockbuster in my town. And so that was part of it. And then Microsoft Flight Simulator. Those were the two sort of foundational moments of my love of aviation. And I think, I often say that young people are inspired by either military airliners or know someone who has a small plane. It's typically how they get into it. For me, it was really, those were the two things that sort of introduced me to aviation. Was the original flying out of Meigs Field, which, rest in peace.
Okay. Yeah, Meigs Field, wow.
Yeah, that was the default.
I only got in there a couple of times. It's beautiful.
Well, I've never been, except in a virtual thing. They bulldozed it. So, but that was sort of my first entree into the love of aviation.
And did you do, what was your flight instruction experience like? Was it intense and short, or was it spread out over time?
So I didn't.
So you had to wait
ticket until I was 17. So it was, it was a lot of hours accumulated with a lot of different instructors. I think one of the big challenges is that you're meeting a lot of instructors, a lot of different personalities. I actually think has become a huge benefit to me. And I continued through college until about age 20, continued to fly, and then I just stopped. It took a 20-year hiatus from aviation. So it wasn't as if I continued. I did all of the work to get my IFR except the actual check ride. But I took a 20-year hiatus and picked it up back when I was 4 years old, about 4 years ago.
I thought maybe you'd use it in business, but today maybe, but not so much then.
You got busy building businesses and running, having a family, and I've got 5 kids. And a couple of years ago, as a founder of an entrepreneur, in the early days, you're the janitor, you're doing payroll, you're the HR person, you're also the CEO, and you get to a point as you scale a business, and Freightways was getting to the point of having a lot of success, where I realized I'm not good at any of those jobs. And so I ended up firing myself from every functional job. And when you're in an early stage venture capital backed company, your only job is to work, raise capital and keep investors happy. And we didn't need to do that any longer. The company started to make money and it was in pretty good shape. So I really had nothing to do. And I had always felt guilty about not continuing my aviation experience. And during COVID, really nothing going on, decided to go take it back up. And that's what I did 4 years ago.
So share a little bit about what the company is now, or the company that you're...
So Freightways is effectively the Bloomberg of the global supply chain. So what Bloomberg does in the financial economy, we aspire to do in the physical goods economy. So we see about 80% of the global economy move on a real-time basis. So I can tell you, we are oftentimes early indicators. We track if it's physical goods, chances are we see the activity happening in the economy. So every container that's loaded in China, we see every air freight transaction around the world. We see not every truck, but a large percent of the U.S. truckload market we see on a real-time basis. We're not in the business of matching freight. We're in the business of providing intelligence to what's happening. So we have a group of reporters that are reporting on whether it's geopolitical issues. So big story right now, there's a couple of big stories happening globally. One is the Suez Canal So we have military experts that are sort of talking about sort of what's happening around ships and how the military is responding to that. Because ultimately, civilian supply chains are impacted by these developments. And so if you're running a supply chain, so let's say that you're the president or you're the head of supply chain for Ford Motor Company, and the president of the United States tweets that he's going to shut down the border if he doesn't, if Mexico doesn't pay for his wall, you have to respond to that. Because all of a sudden, when Donald Trump did that, he's like, he gave him a week to sort of resolve this. And look, Donald Trump says a lot of crazy stuff. Sometimes he actually follows through with it. It's hard to know which side of Donald Trump have you gotten. Those are issues that the decision makers that run those supply chains have to respond to. During COVID, we were tracking the COVID issue in January of 2020 before it clearly came here, and we were seeing what was happening in China and then Europe, and clearly knew there was going to be a major issue here in the United States months before it became apparent that it was happening. But all of the product that you see that we all depend on for our lives and our economy and our life, ultimately how to live, those physical goods have to move. And no matter how big your company is, chances are you don't see the whole world because it's so fragmented. There are millions of companies that produce products and millions of companies that ship those products. You don't have a central sort of information source. So we are the nerve center, essentially, taking all this data, really big data, and tracking what moves in a real-time basis. And then we have reporters and analysts that study that data and on a daily basis publish about 50 articles about what's happening. And we try to contextualize it in a way that people understand. How do I translate this issue? Is the Red Sea attacks an issue? Is the Panama Canal drought going to be a problem? What about the flooding in California? Is that going to be an issue if you're in produce and you move produce and you run a grocery supply chain? Absolutely. So these are things that people depend on us. We have meteorologists, we have defense analysts, we have we have economists, and our job is to help keep the global economy running.
So you're very entrepreneurial. I know from this discussion and other things I've heard in your podcast, you clearly acquire a great deal of information. So at some point, it occurred to you it would be a good idea to buy Flying Magazine. And I'm wondering what prompted that notion.
So I took back up with aviation in March of 2021, I think. And I started, and so one of the things about FreightWaves is we have a large media, we have about 50 reporters and analysts that are putting out content. And so I've learned and loved the media business. Like, I think it's a pretty powerful opportunity to shape the way people talk about topics. And we're non-political. Like, we don't get into the politics of if you looked at the voting record of our staff, it's probably as disparate as any company in America. We only look at the nature of what a supply chain, like, regardless of a decision, we're looking at that. So but I learned media has a way of sort of shaping the way people think about the world in a really powerful way. But it also creates an opportunity to create a really efficient sales channel, because you're influencing the way people think about a topic, but you're also having the opportunity to build product alongside it. And as a pilot, so I fell in love with media, and I was sort of re-consuming aviation media, and I was uninspired. I remember reading Flying Magazine and like, man, it really sucks. Like, what has happened to this magazine that I had grown up with? In the 90s, it was like the Michael Jordan. Remember Michael Jordan was on Sports Illustrated before Sports Illustrated went kind of off the radar or went off, sort of did this thing. Sports Illustrated was really, really cool. And flying as a pilot was really, really cool. And so I was like, I can do a better job than they can. And I just decided I wanted to go buy it. And for me, this is a passion project. I never expected it to be a business. I expected it to make money or at least break even, but I never actually expected to build a business around it. But as an entrepreneur, it's hard not to sort of see opportunities once you own it.
It has an obviously special place. In fact, for audience participation moment, how many of you, when you first thought about flying, read Flying Magazine? Then I hope the second magazine was the AOPA magazine. But, certainly for me, that Flying Magazine was around for years before I actually became a pilot. And so I think all of us have to be very pleased that this is a publication now that's reaching more people, that's having more impact on people, and you've acquired other elements to talk about that strategy.
So we
expanding out.
We did 17 acquisitions last year. We bought 35 brands. So Plane and Pilot, Flying. We've got an airline enthusiast site called Airline Geeks. We bought Find a Pilot, which is a pilot sort of job matching. Think of it as ultimately LinkedIn for pilots. But we've done a number of acquisitions. IFR Magazine, which also came with Aviation Safety, Aviation Consumer, Kit Planes, AvWeb. So we've just acquired a lot of them. And ultimately, all these properties had one thing in common, is they were underinvested. Like almost every single one of them had, and media has faced an enormous change. The internet has effectively destroyed a lot of the media business models. But my background is in big data. This is what I do. And I felt like there was an opportunity to take and put a lot of investment around the data element of these publications, which has been where a lot of the media businesses have not made those investments.
Okay, now explain what that means.
So, if you think about a media company, ultimately what a media company does is it has content, but it also, by way of consuming content, there's a lot of data on what consumers read, what products they're interested in. There's an enormous amount of value in understanding what the readers ultimately consuming. One of the other acquisitions we did was we're now the second largest aircraft marketplace. So Controllers is sort of the dominant. But for used aircraft, we bought a bunch of marketplaces, AdBuyer, and put them under a brand called Aircraft for Sale. And out of that, what we get is what we call intent data. So if someone's searching for a Cessna 172 or searching for a SR-20, or a Piper from 1942, we're seeing all that data across our system. And ultimately, we're learning what buyers want. And from that information, we have this massive archive that goes back to 1927 of flying. Chances are that if there's an aircraft that's produced, chances are that somewhere in our archive, even if it's a Kit plane, we have written an article about that aircraft at some point. Imagine when you're in that marketplace, knowing that you're wanting to buy a Piper Cub or a 172, that we can serve that content up. We're providing the user the ability to understand more about that aircraft, become more informed. What is the editorials, sort of impartial editorial reviews? What's the safety record of the aircraft? What's the performance metrics of that aircraft? And if I'm looking at a 1942 aircraft, those editors are probably the people who were around when the aircraft was produced, probably are long gone. We happen to have their history through our archives, and so we have the opportunity to serve that up. And that's really, when you think about data, it's about understanding what the consumer is trying to do and trying to help them make better decisions. And one of the other sort of byproducts of that is we built an algorithm to go out and look at all the pricing. So if you buy an aircraft today, you can go buy like VREF and other pricing services, but those are expensive to go buy, do an appraisal on an aircraft. One of the things that we have built is almost, we call it plane price. It's the Zestimate of, it's sort of ridiculous when you buy an airplane. It's this massive opaque process. It takes a lot of steps to sort of get from, figuring out what aircraft you want to own and buy to sort of purchasing, and then all the things you have to do. We're trying to make that really seamless by bringing in the content together, the data that we capture. We know what people are interested in, what they're not interested in, and then ultimately serve it in a way that the consumer can sort of purchase it. So that's really what we're building, is this sort of, we call it a walled garden, but the idea is that we want to keep buyers inside of our universe as long as possible.
So I want to go back for a minute on the data, because one of the things that we always struggled with at AOPA was the print publication reached a very large audience, but we were appealing. It was not always clear what appealed most to them. My joke was always, if I'm talking about flying a Husky, then the jet guys are going, they're backcountry guys. As soon as I start talking about the Citation, those guys, they're giving up the old, fabric-covered aircraft. And yet, when we started Aviation eBrief, we knew exactly what people, because it's electronic, exactly what people were looking at, clicking on, what they were interested in. By the way, the the questionnaire survey is the feature most popular, I think still to this day. But we could mine that to better understand what the audience wanted. Harder in a print publication.
You can't do that in print. And I think one of the big discussions that we had, or sort of arguments, was that sort of a legacy print team sort of believed they understood what the audience wanted. And the reason they believed they understood what the audience wanted is because, the thing about aviation is it's a relatively small business, but there's so many different niche pockets. So if you're into turbine aircraft, the people you surround yourself with in aviation are into turbine aircraft. You assume that's what people want to read. Or if you're into kit planes, you assume people want to read kit planes. And I think what we learned through data, because Vonnier did a really poor job of using data to sort of track consumption, we had built out really intense models to understand it. What we learned is our audience is highly interested in topics that people assumed were not. We know that our audience loves flight simulator content. It was a big argument internally about whether we should include flight simulator content. In fact, Patrick, who's coming up next, is one of our contributors because there was a belief that pilots want to consume real-world content and doesn't care about the flight simulator. And what we learned by publishing these articles is that opened up an entirely new audience, but also existing pilots were really found that refreshing that we were talking about seeing the world through sort of a different channel or a different opportunity. We learned that our audience loves reading about aircraft they can buy. We bought this aircraft for sale, or launched aircraft for sale, and one of our most popular articles every single day, and we do this daily, we do a daily pick. Our editors will pick an aircraft from the marketplace, and they're just basically writing about it in the editorial publication. And one of the things we found is those are the most popular pieces. And frankly, shocking that those are the most popular pieces. And they're not written as marketing pieces. They're written on an editorial sort of perspective because the people that are writing that are pilots as well, and they're dreaming about owning this aircraft. And there's some really cool ones. There's some really weird ones. Like they may see a really interesting library that they want to talk about, or something that's somewhat of a strange kind of aircraft, or something that is something that is I think today or yesterday was a Vision jet. But what we're learning through these different publications of these different audiences is what the aviation audience, and that's one of the things about digital media that's really powerful, unlike print. When you print something, it goes out into the world and you don't know. You don't know if it ever gets read. You just know it's out. The thing about digital is you get real-time feedback. It's a lot of dopamine that goes into these sort of post stories because you immediately get feedback on what the audience cares about. And I think it's sort of a moment of truth for media. But one of the things about print is that a lot of folks, a lot of companies have discounted print. I actually am a true believer that print is a really powerful vehicle, and I'll tell you why. Because if you look at a print magazine, you're not being inundated in the feed. The problem with digital is that if you're reading it on Twitter or X, or you're reading it on a website, your emails are pouring in, your Slack messages are pouring in, your text messages are pouring in. You're getting constantly distracted. It's hard to consume an article that's very long on a screen, but you can get lost in the content. One of the things we tried to do at Flying is create a beautiful journey. So we focus a lot on high-end photography and stories that really captivate you and draw you in more in a way that really makes sense for print.
So one of the questions I have to ask, and we're going to get to more flight training in a minute here, but I know for us and what we were doing at AOPA, we could have a lot of ideas, but ultimately you had to have advertisers that embraced the concept because they found it rewarding. How are the manufacturers and those that advertise, how are they responding to what you're doing?
Ultimately, they care about top of funnel. At the end of the day, our job is to bring them business. I mean, we can sit there and say they care about all these other things. At the end of the day, what every single advertiser has in common is they want to increase their business. They want to influence how people think about their brand or to buy something. And our job is to deliver those leads. And the only way that we get the right to do that is to create content that is compelling enough, interesting enough that people consume it, and they ultimately buy it. One of the big mistakes that has happened in the media business, particularly magazines, is that companies have cheapened the quality of the magazine, and they've lowered the price. We did the opposite. And the first thing, Lisa sitting up front, she can attest to this, is the first thing I did was I tripled the price of the magazine. We increased the quality of it. We doubled, the cost of our magazine's twice what it was before, but we also quadrupled the price of it. And we said, look, we're okay with losing 40% of our subscribers, because the reality is, if a subscriber is not willing to pay $30 or $40 a year for a aviation magazine, they're either not interested in the content and willing to support it, so that tells them something about us, or they're not your prospective buyers. No, a guy or a lady that's not going to spend $40 a year on an aviation magazine is also not likely to go buy a $1 million Cirrus or a $10,000 avionics package or whatever it is. And that's the sort of the message, is that we have to be better at going to the right audience. And I think that's one of the things that's been important.
And has it been an advantage to have in a kind of a portfolio, if you will, of
we also segment
products?
The audience. One of the things that I heard a lot when we bought Flying was that it's for rich people. It's an aspirational magazine. It's only for rich people. And at first it was sort of like, should we address this? Should we sort of democratize the content? As we bought Plane and Pilot, and as we bought Kit Planes, and we bought AvWeb, what we realized is it actually affords us an opportunity to sort of lean into this aspirational element of flying, where flying can be aspirational. There's nothing wrong. We shouldn't apologize that we have a Gulfstream G650 or 700 on the cover, or a $1.3 million SR-22. Like, we shouldn't apologize for that. That's what makes aviation cool and sexy. And I can tell you by looking at the data, that's what people read. Like, we all, that may be out of your sort of personal ability to sort of afford that, but the audience, that's what they want to read. They want to read about the stuff and dream about the stuff that they want to have. And it could be a $200,000 LSA, and it's aspirational for a certain group of people. But what we also have is titles like Plane and Pilot, which are a bit more functional. It's not about being aspirational. It's more about how to deal with a problem, or how to deal with maintaining an aircraft or something like that. With Kit Planes, it's like, how do you build an aircraft? And so one of the things about having these multiple brands is we don't have to compete. One of the problems that Plane and Pilot had was that the editor wanted to be flying, and she kept trying to create content that was trying to be flying. And what we realize now is we went back to the basics of Plane and Pilot and said it should focus on the pilot-flown aircraft and the journey, and not apologize for the fact that it has aircraft that are more aged, that have more maintenance challenges than some of the newer stuff, because now we have different audience that we can serve. And so through all this data, through this journey, we get a lot of sort of understanding of how the audience thinks. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is turn that into action, so that if you run a flight school, what attracts people to this industry? Why would they want to become a pilot? And that's the data we're accumulating, is understanding how do we take someone and introduce them to that love of aviation, the way I was introduced to my Microsoft Flight Simulator. How do we take that desire and turn it into action? And that's the journey that we're on right now with all this data, is trying to take really understand the reader and the philosophy of what drives them to go out and try that first flight instruction. Or when do we see them, and I think this is even more challenging for the folks in this audience, is when they drop out. Like, why are we not retaining? I mean, you think about the number of, you would know the data better than I do, but I think, 60,000 people a year apply for student medical license, and only like 20,000 finish it or something. Like, what happened to those 40,000 people? And our hope is that we can figure that out and try to find ways to attract the right audience and keep them into the program.
By the way, that number, which I looked at a lot when I was at AOPA, it's even greater when you think that to get the student pilot certificate, you've already gone through a lot of steps.
Absolutely.
You've gone to an FBO. You've inquired about flight training. You've thought about it. You've learned the cost. I mean, and so many people fall out in that very process. They just don't understand,
Craig, how many people in your life, and I hear this all the time, I'm sure you do as well, and I'm sure everybody in this room could attest to this, is have you been told, I always want to learn to fly? Like, it comes up. You guys all hear this, right? Like, probably 4 or 5 times a day. I always wanted to learn to fly. And they can't give you a reason why they never did. They were busy, they had kids.
We had a technique that we used in election years, really around public policy, but we could buy just 3 or 4 questions on a big national survey. And we'd use it to look at, as I said, public policy questions. But one year I put on there, would you like in the next 10 years to fly an airplane, actually fly the airplane? If you extrapolate the return, it was 30 million people. So
why are there only 700,000 people?
Happened? Okay, so I want to. Nobody here can doubt, listening just for a short while, but nobody can doubt, the entrepreneurial talents and experience you bring to these tasks. Well, what do you? And I want to tell you that this audience, that we're always very proud that the people come here, because they really are the best of the best. They're the ones that are here to learn what's new, the ones to see if there's some new ideas, to share their ideas with others. The flight training community, when you look at data, and I know you'll appreciate this, what we learned a dozen or more years ago is that problem of dropouts absolutely exists, but that's the aggregate number that you were using. So what we found were there were flight schools, they graduated 90% of the students they got. There were others who graduated 5 or 10. They were just basically getting on an airplane as long as they lasted, and then they'd leave. So the question then became, well, if we can understand what really works, and since we really actually want to see people matriculate out the other end of this process, what's it going to take? Turns out flight simulators are part of that equation. And these folks have really been students of that. So you're not going to insult them if you have any concerns about flight training, because, as I said, they're in a group that's different than most or many. But have you kind of wrapped your entrepreneurial mind around this question of, can we run a better flight school? Is there a process to improve this industry that hasn't changed
not what
that
I do. Much? I mean, I can't tell people in this room have run flight schools. It's disingenuous for me to suggest how they should run a better flight school. I don't know that answer. But what I do know is that we are on the cusp of probably the greatest opportunity in aviation that has existed since the Cold War. When you think about this and the data is pretty astounding. The amount of growth that's happening both in the United States and globally of investment dollars going in from both the private and public sector and aviation-related infrastructure, capital spending, airplanes, innovation is astounding. And what happened, sort of going back into the history of it, is if you go back to sort of how the sort of golden days of aviation, when we got supersonic flight and we sort of were introduced to all this new technology, that was the 60s and 70s, and that was brought on by the governments, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, pouring billions of dollars into Cold War spending. Well, when the Berlin Wall fell, we didn't have the need or incentive, and you know this in Washington, to go spend that money. And the private sector didn't pick it up for 20 years. But what we've seen over the last decade is this massive impouring of venture capital, private sector money, emerging countries. In some countries, the compounded rate of growth of aviation is 25%. I had to go back and double check this fact. When I saw CAGR, which is a term for compounded annual growth rates, of 25% in certain countries, of how big. Because what happens is, as countries become wealthier, they end up people want to travel. And that's what's happening all around the world. And what that means is that pilot demand is just going to exponentially increase, whether it's new technologies like UAVs or just some of the electric eVTOL type stuff. The military is putting a lot of demand on pilots, as well as what's happening in emerging countries. And that means that we have an opportunity in our industry, in aviation, to be a part of one of the greatest growth opportunities that has ever existed. And we're at a technologically inflection point where new technology is coming into the industry. And yes, some of this and most of this will end up failing. A lot of these business ventures and UAVs and flying taxis, a lot of that stuff is going to fail. It's all going to go to zero. But the byproduct of that money and that investment and that innovation and that research stays. And I think what we see now is that the private sector and the public sector are actually pouring trillions of dollars into all of these new technologies that we're all going to benefit from. And I think it's not just in aviation, it's in space. And all this is going to inspire younger people. Like, there's a lot of studies on demographics of, I talk to a lot of folks in flight schools and talking about how you guys are all busy, right? Like, you've never been busier. I hear this all the time. And it's being driven by the financial opportunities that exist at the airlines. But I think it's also happening because of people like Elon Musk that are launching rockets that land themselves. It's happening because of the YouTube generation. It's happening because of Instagram. And all this stuff is driving young people to think this is a really cool and sexy thing to do. And I think that's just an opportunity that every one of us have a chance to sort of expand on.
Yeah, there's no question those opportunities draw people into it. And my hope, because it's certainly a case in my life, I was never in the military and I never flew commercially, but I've flown since I was 15 years old. I started at 15. And I always remember talking to a CEO of a company once whose son had gotten his private pilot certificate, and I met with this fellow the next day, and he says, I was just so disappointed. My son wasn't excited enough. And he said, I told him, this is going to change your life. Don't you understand? And I think for most of us it has. I mean, it's given us something to strive for and do that, sets you apart in many ways. So people always ask me about flying, and I'm sure they do you as well now all the time. So there is that desire, and it's certainly looking like there's more opportunities. I'm going to give you another question, and you could ask me one too. But we are going to have some time. It looks like, or does it look like? You guys will tell me. But if anybody has a question or two, somebody will have a microphone. Raise your hand; they'll bring it to you, and we'll let Craig take a couple questions from the audience. My question, though, while they're thinking, is so as you look out on this aviation space that you're in. You may not wish to answer this, but are there components that you want for what you're building that you don't have yet? Are there opportunities you see out there? Or you've had a pretty healthy acquisition path the last year or so.
Yeah, it's weird. I don't have a background in M&A. I'm a founder entrepreneur. And I think one of the things that we have the opportunity to do, and we're building this, but it's, it takes longer to start something. It usually ends up better because you built it the way you want it than buying something and sort of changing it because you sort of are stuck with some of the sort of limitations of that business. But one of the things that we're really trying to construct is we have an opportunity, and I think uniquely at flying, to sort of work through that entire career journey for a professional pilot, but also an aspirational pilot. From the moment they want to learn to fly, they're likely consuming some content to learn about it. So that is creating the sex appeal around the excitement, the adventure, the journey of becoming a pilot, what it means for them. Then it's as they start to take up their first instruction, maybe it's how do they even find a flight instructor and how do they vet high-quality flight instructors? I think there's opportunities to build something there. There's opportunities to, once they're in, they're in the cockpit, is to reinforce the training. All the way through their career, how do they expand their career to get to the airlines? And when they're in the middle part of their career, how do they think about wealth management? And then retirement, what happens after retirement? And so I think we have the opportunity, not just through acquisitions, but organically, this is where data comes in, is to build an entire footprint of a pilot's life and to understand what that journey is going to be like so that we can help give them the tools to make more successful choices or choices that drive success for their life. But also potentially to inform folks that are in this room and others about what people really want. And the data will tell us that. The data will ultimately tell us what people are really doing inside the airplane, want to do inside the airplane, and what that journey looks like. And we have the opportunity to do this. You may be familiar with this study. I think one of the most fascinating studies I've ever read, and this is not an aviation thing, is the Harvard longitudinal study. Are you familiar with it? It is, by the way, if you have a book and you want to have the handbook to life, go pick this up. It's based on the Grant study. And it's about the Harvard longitudinal study. It's probably one of the most profound books I've ever read. But in it was actually I think it was 1930s, the Depression. Harvard set out and did this study where they studied people's entire lives until they died. So when they were in college all the way through, and they looked at happiness and what drove happiness and success and things like aging and death and disease and money and all this stuff and divorce rates. The reason it's so fascinating is this is an 80-year study of following someone's life. And I think we have the opportunity through our sort of very broad set of resources to understand, not anecdotally, there's so much anecdote in this business, but also through data on what truly drives someone to advance their career and truly stays in this business and all the things that they want to do along the way. And I think that's a pretty powerful opportunity.
Well said. Well said. It's fascinating. Actually, the AOPA program that Mark's and the team have pushed so hard, the Rusty Pilot program, is great because it's bringing people back, many of whom thought, well, I can't do that. You came back at a younger age, but some of these folks, a lot of people I talk to now, they flew at one point in time and then had a family, and now they're nearing retirement or retired, and suddenly, flying is an option for them again, and it's very exciting. Okay, we have anybody out there with a question? Boy, you had a good lunch, a big lunch. Okay, well, we paused.
So let me ask you a question, Craig.
Fire away.
So the FAA has done a pretty stand-up job of creating a very safe way to travel. Commercial aviation is among the safest way to travel, or frankly, one of the safest things you could do. GA, the record's a bit spottier at times. Where's the FAA letting us down?
With respect to private pilot safety record?
Yeah,
or just in general?
Not in terms of safety, but in terms of the lack of innovation.
So one of the most interesting things I did it was before I left AOPA, but it continued on after I left, was serve on the FAA's Management Advisory Council, which reported to the FAA administrator, Michael Huerta, at the time. And one of the things I came to understand is that over time, the mentality was that they had clients, and the clients were the manufacturers and the airlines, the large aircraft. And there is now a group for general aviation, but it was smaller. It tended to be a place that somebody would be for a while, and then they'd move up to more responsibility. And yet, I came to believe that, to use the phrase, where they were letting us down, but really the aviation community down, is that the innovation was happening with the private pilots. My 1991 or so Bonanza had more technology in it than a lot of the air carriers had in their cockpits, because we were adopting GPS and Garmin systems, and whether we had them installed or carried them in, we were using them. There was a debate for a while. It seems ludicrous now, but the FAA wouldn't certify the electronic devices to show somebody where it was unsafe to fly. So one of the leading causes of accidents was flight into known terrain.
Yeah.
And yet now we just use the Garmin and other products to see terrain all the time, and they had capability wasn't as great, but it was there. And we said to the FAA, you exist to reduce risk. Can we get that? And what's happened is that you will not make a change in regulation because you believe that the current regulation is safe, and if you change it, you're not sure what the risk is. We're here to tell you, and Pete Bunce is still in the room, Pete and Ed and a few of us were together with the administrator out of Oshkosh one day. We said, we're here to tell you that you're actually increasing our risk by the failure to make a decision. Certify this equipment. Let us use it. Let us put it in the airplanes. And they did, ultimately. But I think the general aviation has constantly been in competition for attention of the senior decision makers with airlines and manufacturers. And I get it; they're hauling millions of people and all that, but the innovation and it comes more in the general aviation area. It comes first, and I think they should pay more attention to that. And I think they have. Now, the deputy administrator is now, at the time, he left for a while. He's now back as the administrator, and he understands some of this. He's an airline guy, but he understands some of this. But in Washington, you just need a constant pressure. And that's where the associations, I think, have played on behalf of the general aviation community a very important role, and they've really never been closer. They have different, so they may have different segments of the community they represent, but they very much work in tandem when it comes to the advocacy work they do.
But I think the FAA medical, that whole regime should be overhauled. Mental health is a big problem right now, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of motivation to do so.
Yeah, so I'm not as clear to that. We talked to them about changing the requirements with the medical, and there's a lot of resistance to it, but it's helped. It's helped keep some people flying. I think the complexity of medication now is perhaps greater than it was. So yeah, and really, I won't apologize for the FAA, but one of their challenges is they don't get the funding they need from Congress. So that's a constant battle to get enough people to do some of the work that we need to have done.
Yeah, I don't envy the job of having to convince administrator bureaucrats that they need to change things. So.
Yeah, well, in Washington, needless to say, has changed a lot. Although the group of associations a few years ago worked with members of Congress to form an aviation caucus, and it became one of, if not the largest in Congress. And so there really is a strong base of support there. But it just takes.
Do you have an opinion on the election on whether the Republicans or Democrats win, whether that's better for GA?
My opinion on the election is probably should not talk about it. If the question is, will it make a difference? I think we enjoy strong support in Congress. We enjoy, I think a very good relationship with the FAA. Interestingly enough, in 2016, when Donald Trump was elected, he wanted to make his chief pilot the head of the FAA, and Congress said, we're not so sure that's a good idea. But at least he's very familiar with private aviation. I don't know how the election is going to come out, number one. I think, though, that probably more than anything else, the impact has to do with the economy. I, for one, lifelong Republican, but I, for one, think that for some reason, Joe Biden has not gotten the credit he deserves for policies or theoretically policies that have improved the economy, because the economy has improved. And my guess is it's going to continue to do so this election, through the election year. And that has an impact on advertisers, on people coming to flight schools and things like that. So that would be a good thing. Policies that would tend to be detrimental to the economy would certainly harm aviation.
Yeah, I mean, one could argue that we probably need a different DOT administrator. Pete Buttigieg's got to go.
Well, yeah, and he probably will, because I think he probably wants to run for office again. But listen, you've been great to listen to us. I'm going to do something that I can tell you for sure I have never, ever done before on stage, and that is to ask you to thank Craig Fuller for a great job.
Thank you so much.